Okay, this is the third video in our series on exploration, causes, and events, where we're going to focus on the Southern Wave. The Southern Wave took place between 1450 and 1600. So, what we know is that starting in 1450, new nation states developed in Europe, and that these nations, suffering from the gold famine, sponsored exploration to finance their states and eventually ended up building maritime empires. So, what we want to know is how maritime empires are built. In the last video, we saw that these maritime empires were built through establishing trading posts in the Eastern Hemisphere and colonies in the Western Hemisphere that brought in wealth in the form of gold and silver in one of three ways: finding it, selling a commodity, and controlling trade to Asia. What we're looking at today is specific case studies. So, what we want to make sure that we know is who was involved in the Southern Wave, where they established their empires, who was involved, and finally, how they got wealth. So, this is the Iberian Peninsula. And as I said in video number one, this used to be ruled by Muslims. The Muslims of Al Andalus ruled this area for a very long time and actually did pass on a lot of maritime technology into Europe. But starting in about 1400, 1450, these states filled with Europeans who were Christians revolted and took over the peninsula, forcing the Muslims out. It created two countries, Portugal and Spain. The Portuguese and the Spanish both benefited from the technology left behind and created more, but to centralize their states, to legitimize their governments, to make their people happy through making a market economy and become powerful, they had to find sources of gold. So trade is intensifying because of this, and essentially what they want is gold. And remember, gold and silver not only equals wealth that can create a market economy, that could centralize and legitimize a government, but it also equals power. The amount of power that you have as a nation in Europe is not measured in the size of your navy or army or the amount of cannons. It's how much gold and silver. So as they're going out and exploring and establishing their empires, they essentially find wealth. So wealth is important because to build the nation, to be number one, and wealth is going to be found across the world in areas that have gold and silver, in areas that produce commodities or have new commodities, and to find direct access to commodities trade in Asia. So this gave them the ability to build maritime empires. So we talk about the Southern Wave. This is the Iberian Wave, and this is made up of Spain and Portugal. And they were first because they're more unified. They had a tradition of maritime activity and leftover technology from Al Andalus, and they really don't have anything that they could sell. So they're really suffering from the gold famine. The Portuguese essentially begin to build their empire because Prince Henry conquered the city of Ceuta. Ceuta is right across the Straits of Gibraltar in what's today Morocco on the northern coast of Africa. And essentially, they found a ton of gold. And being a new nation, Prince Henry basically said, "Where's this gold?" Well, essentially, what happens is he's told that there's gold in sub Saharan Africa. So instead of marching an army across a desert, he goes back to essentially begin to build maritime technology, not only to grow sugar, but to find the gold and get access to trade. So this is basically a map showing the explorers. We have, first of all, Bartholomew Diaz, which is represented by the gold, who's exploring the coast of Africa to find access to the gold trade there, to find sugar that they could sell, to buy slaves. Well, he finds that Africa has a bottom, goes back, tells Da Gama about it. Da Gama's represented by the blue, who goes around Africa, finds the Swahili trading cities, establishes forts there, and gets all the way to Calicut and gives them essentially a trading post empire in the Eastern Hemisphere. So, essentially, some key areas that they established their trading posts. First of all, we have the Gold Coast, especially a place called Sanjao Dominia, which did not provide them any gold. They never found the sources of the gold trade. What they did find is slave trade. They also found, through Diaz, the southern tip of Africa and established some trading posts there. And then Da Gama established a direct trade route to Calicut. Later, Cabral, trying to retrace Da Gama's route, swings even wider and claims Brazil for Portugal, giving them another area where they could get sugar from. So, this is a map of their trading post empire. Every dot represents a fort ruled by the Portuguese that was designed to control trade of known commodities. This was done by Alphonse de Albuquerque, and essentially, the Portuguese even tried to create a passport system very similar to the Mongols to further control trade. So Alphonse de Albuquerque, he was the architect of this system, and this guy was a bloody guy because he measured his success in the amount of non-Christians that he killed, sending back the ears of all that he killed in establishing this to Portugal to show that he was working. Probably his biggest success was the conquest of Malacca. So the goal of the Portuguese in the Eastern Hemisphere was not to conquer territory. It was too difficult. But what they sought to do is control trade by establishing key fortified trading posts, a trading post empire, and forcing merchant vessels to buy passports to pay taxes. Now, the Portugals also ruled Brazil. And in Brazil, they looked for gold, didn't find a lot, but they began to produce sugar. And sugar is very labor intensive. So, on these sugar plantations, known as NGOs, they would bring in slaves to produce sugar to sell across Europe, making gold and silver. So, politically, they sought to control this directly. Government agents were sent out to be able to control the trading posts and the colony of Brazil to make sure that the people there followed the laws. This was made up of viceroys, and their empire was divided into provinces called viceroyalties. This gave the native born Portuguese, known as peninsulars, a great deal of power because they were on top of the social hierarchy. So, how did the Portuguese bring in wealth? Well, first of all, sugar. They were able to sell it and make lots of gold and silver. They also were the primary traders of African slaves at the beginning. They also controlled the pepper and spice trade into Europe. Remember, for a majority of their early work, no other European country was doing this. Well, Spain basically took over. And the Spanish, they were in even a worse situation than the Portuguese because they were not only a new nation, they were very separate. You've probably heard of Ferdinand and Isabella. Well, their marriage made Spain, but they ruled two completely different areas. And so there's not a lot of unity. Plus, the Reconquista, well, that's essentially reclaiming the Iberian Peninsula that Spain came to rule from the Muslims. This is where the Spanish Inquisition comes in. More on that much later in the course. So, what they did is they began to literally steal the technology that the Portuguese developed. But knowing that in a war, a naval war, they would lose to the Portuguese and lose Catholic Church support, they sought a shorter access to Asian trade. So this is where Chris Columbus comes in. Christopher Columbus sold his idea to Ferdinand and Isabella that sailing to the west, not the east, would bring the Spanish ships to India much faster than the Portuguese ships. He went on 4 separate expeditions to try to prove his point. Unfortunately, he died not knowing that he had discovered a new area. So, this is the Eastern Hemisphere that we saw. When we look at the Western Hemisphere, what happens is the Pope gets involved, and as you know from your reading, divides the world between the Portuguese and the Spanish to avoid a war. It awards the Portuguese the Eastern Hemisphere with Brazil and the Spanish the Western. So it was not until the work of Amerigo Vespucci that Spain realized that they were not finding India, but rather a brand new land. Now, to further their claims in the world, they sent out Magellan. And Magellan's important because he led the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe, to go around it. Unfortunately, when he got to the Philippines, after claiming it for the Catholic Church and the Spanish, he was killed. But hey, his body did make it home, shown by that dark green route that starts off going by South America and ends up coming in the right side of the frame in the Pacific. So this gave the Spanish this whole new land to try to explore. So the Spanish almost gave up this land, but they began to see the results of what the Aztecs and the Incas did. And finding gold, it kind of motivated them to be able to take over these 2 areas and establish colonies. Cortez basically was a second born who conquered the Aztecs. He burned his ships and basically used all the people that the Aztecs included in their tribute system to defeat them, establishing a colony called Mexico. And Pizarro went down and conquered the Incas. So, what gave them the ability to do this was not only the diseases, but their iron weapons. When we talk about the Spanish Empire, it's made up of colonies, and these colonies are called viceroyalties. The Spanish used direct control, just like the Portuguese did, establishing and sending native born Spaniards to the area to rule to make sure that all of the wealth flowed into Spain. As you can see, their empire was extensive. They even developed part of the government called the Council of the Indies to manage their affairs. The main problem with that is they did not meet in the New World, they met in Spain. And so decisions were very slow and very inefficient. Viceroyalties were created and courts were developed to enforce Spanish law called audiencias. When we talk about the economics of this area, the Spanish basically they benefited from mining silver and through sugar production, using key labor systems such as the encomienda, which essentially gives every Spaniard peninsular who goes there a group of natives that they can use for labor. They also adopted the MITA, so each encomienda could send workers to work in the mines, and they also developed food through the hacienda. This is essentially, think of this like plantations. Since there were so many natives that they controlled, even though a lot of them died, they could use this and not depend upon the slave trade. Their biggest find was Potosi. Potosi is the world's largest silver deposit. And as you can see, even today, silver is still being pulled out of this mountain. This gave the Spanish a lot of power, a lot of gold and silver. But the Spanish, they weren't the smartest people in the world, and they never really developed anything else. So every bit of silver that they brought in, they had to use to essentially buy goods from other nations. So when we look at the Spanish Empire, we know it's in the Western Hemisphere, which stretches from the Americas all the way to the Philippines. So it's a colonial empire. They profited from sugar from the island of Hispaniola. They found silver at Potosi and Zacatecas, the world's two largest silver deposits. And they controlled trade from China through what is known as the Manila Galleons. This is the direct trade route that they took Potosi silver to the Philippines and traded for Chinese goods, bringing them back to Europe to sell. So, this brings us to the end of part three, which is the Southern wave. In the next part, we'll look at the last wave.